Hello, everybody. It's your boy, Mr. Ansharsky, back at it again with yet another AP World History video. I look so concerned when I'm saying that. I didn't mean to be. But anyway, welcome again to AP World History. Today, we are going to continue Chapter 3, Part 2, talking about new imperialism in Asia and in the Americas. So on the screen right now, you got your bell work. What are some of the changes we're seeing in Africa between 1800 and 1914? So today we're going to mostly focus on what's going on in Asia. We'll start out in Central Asia and work our way down to Southeast Asia. And then finally, we'll wrap up with talking about the Americas and the establishment of an informal empire. So you should be able to distinguish between formal and informal imperialism, as we will see. So let's first talk about Asia. So within Central Asia, the major European power is going to be the Russians. And we'll talk about the Russians more next presentation. But essentially, Russia is going to expand southward into Central Asia during the late 1800s. Russia is going to claim significant territory in places like modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of these stands. These are places where we will see Russian expansion using modern military tactics against Central Asian nomads. The Kazakhs, in particular, a group of ethnic Turco-nomads in the center of Asia, they are going to be brutally conquered by the Russian Empire. So as Russia expands southward, why does it want to do this? Well, in the Kazakh steppes, there is a plenty amount of cotton and coal. There is a desire for natural resources, especially as Russia will industrialize by the end of the 19th century. So not industrial yet, but will by the end of the 19th century. And this is why they are going to expand into Central Asia. They want cotton, they want coal for industry. So we are going to see a lot of expansion in the area of Kazakhstan, especially. We are going to see the development of plantations in Central Asia, mostly for cotton. But we're going to see little in the way of cultural hegemony enforced by the Russians. So let's break this word down real quick, because it's important to kind of get this buzzword that we'll talk about a lot in this unit, the idea of hegemony. Hegemony is political, or I should actually broaden it. It is the idea of dominance, that one country is more powerful than a weaker country. And in terms of cultural hegemony, this is an imperial power enforcing its culture over a weaker power. So cultural hegemony is the enforcement of an imperial culture over a colony, over a conquered territory. But we're going to see little of that in Russia, or at least in the Russian Central Asia, the Russian Empire in Central Asia. One place where we will see Russian expansion is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is going to be a desirable place for Russia. And why is that? Well, Afghanistan is a great place to grow opium. And what's opium used for? Well, as a drug, obviously, but it's also a major selling item of European powers in China. So if Russia wants to expand economically in China, it needs the thing China wants. It needs opium. So Russia wants to expand into Afghanistan. However, that's a problem because the British are down here in India, and they're skeptical of Russian advances in Afghanistan. Afghanistan right here is the center between Central Asia under Russia and South Asia under the British. So we are going to see competition between the Russians and the British over this piece of territory. And particularly, there is going to be a series of proxy wars between Russian-backed Afghans and British-backed Afghans. And we call this series of indirect competitions the Great Game, a series of wars between Russian-backed Afghans and British-backed Afghans in the late 19th century. So Afghanistan is an area where we will see spheres of influence being established between the British and the Russians. Another place we see spheres of influence is Persia. Persia will have a Russian sphere of influence and a British sphere of influence. Very similar to what we'll talk about in China next, not next presentation, but the presentation after that. What's going on in Southeast Asia? Well, let's flip this gears a little bit. So Southeast Asia comprised of places like modern-day Myanmar, Malaysia, Indochina, which is Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. These are places that will be colonized by European powers, mostly for cash crop, mostly for economic production. Southeast Asia has rubber and spices. Rubber and spices. These are the two big things Europe wants out of Southeast Asia. So we are going to see colonization of Southeast Asia, mostly for these goods. That was Miss Grimes, if you couldn't hear her. Southeast Asia is going to mostly be conquered by the British, the Dutch, and the French. The only country that will remain independent in Southeast Asia is Siam, or modern-day Thailand. So this is a great area for agricultural production, and as such, you need a lot of workers. Where are you getting these workers? Well, they're from India or China. We will see the immigration of Chinese and Indian workers into Southeast Asia. So this is going to lead to a rise in population in Southeast Asia, especially with the diffusion of immigrants. But immigrants also bring religion with them. We are going to see the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism from these Indian and Chinese workers. But on top of that, we are going to see these immigrant communities adopt Islam as well in some cases. So the spread of Islam is something we can also attribute to migration patterns in the late 19th century. But as a general kind of theme of not only imperialism in Southeast Asia, but imperialism in general at all, is the idea of resistance to imperialism. And how is this going to come about? Well, you need a national identity. And how is that formed? Well, it's through the spreading of European education. This is what the missionaries are bringing. They're bringing with them not only Christianity, but crazy, wacky ideas like nationalism and republicanism, and later on, socialism. So European education is spreading European ideas of revolution. And as such, this is going to be picked up upon by a emerging middle class that resists imperial occupation. So you got European education, you add that with anti-European sentiment, you get nationalism. Nationalism is a way to resist European imperialism, and will be very important when these countries actually become independent nation states. Well, why is Southeast Asia going to be conquered so easily? Well, it's because Southeast Asia is, before European imperialism, a collection of fragmented kingdoms. And we talked about this way back in Unit 1. So we do have a series of weakened kingdoms that are not able to compete industrially or militarily with European invaders. So much of Southeast Asia will be divided between the British, the French, and the Dutch. The British are going to control places like the Malay states, modern day Malaysia. And the British also have a presence in Myanmar, or what they called Burma. And remember, Burma is kind of a buffer zone for the British in India. They want to defend India from, you guessed it, the French. And where do the French have colonies? It's Indochina. French Indochina is made up of the modern day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. So Indochina is an area with French imperialism. However, the French are not going to establish cultural hegemony. They will not enforce French culture on Vietnam. So we are going to see a gurgling, a emerging, I should say, resistance movement. Gurgling is a terrible word. A resistance movement against the French, especially as we have very strong national feelings in Vietnam. So much of Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese history is related to resistance towards the French and later the Americans, but we'll get to that later. We also have the Dutch in Southeast Asia. And what are they up to? Well, they're mostly in modern day Indonesia, what was then called the East Indies. The West Indies are in the Caribbean. The Dutch also have those. But let's focus on the East Indies real quick. Well, the East Indies will become Dutch controlled, largely during the 1600s, during the age of colonization. Remember, the establishment of tribute colonial empires. This was what's going on in the 16th century. The Dutch are going to basically bribe local sultans to say, we're the only ones who can do business here. So places like Java are going to be dominated by the Dutch, going back to the 1600s. We are going to see by the 1700s, most of these Indonesian, Southeast Asian islands being taken over by the Dutch. And the Dutch are going to establish an economic system that favors the spice trade. If you ever think the Dutch, think the spice trade. And in Indonesia, the Dutch will establish what is called a cultivation system. What is the cultivation system? Well, essentially, it is a policy where peasants plant a certain amount of crops, like spices, and then that certain amount of crop is going to be given to the Dutch as a form of taxation. So the cultivation system is a way to exploit natural resources in Indonesia. It's very much like that quota system we mentioned in equatorial Africa. So that's what's going on in Indonesia. That's what's going on in general in Southeast Asia. So I just want to visualize this real quick. So we got China, independent, Japan, independent, making its own little empire in Korea and Formosa, or modern day Taiwan. We'll talk more about Japan next unit. We got Siam down here, modern day Thailand. But then we have the British in India and their buffer colony in Burma. They want to defend India against the French in Indochina. It's called Indochina because it's in the middle of India and China. Indochina. The French are brilliant. We also got the Dutch in Indonesia right here. These are the Dutch East Indies. But for the rest of the lesson, we're going to actually focus on this collection of islands right here, the Philippines, and we'll look at them in just a second. But kind of consider, what are some general things you've seen in imperialism so far? Think cultural reasons why imperialism happens and how it plays out. Think about political reasons, why it happens, and how these colonies are structured. And think about economic similarities and differences. And then finally, consider, what are white dominion colonies, just as a review. And conversely, what are tropical dependency colonies? And then be able to come up with some examples of those places. But the rest of this presentation is mostly focused on the greatest country in the world, the United States, and the creation of both a formal empire and an informal empire. So a formal empire is something we've seen already. It's directly politically controlling a location. It's using a territory as a part that's governed by the government of an empire. However, informal imperialism, as we will see, is more about economic control. A weaker country, I hate to use that word, but a less industrial country will become economically dominated by a more industrial one. And the United States is going to do both of these things throughout the course of the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, and arguably in the 21st century as well. But I will not comment on that. I got an email. So let's take a gander at the establishment of the formal American empire. So America will claim overseas territory, especially in East Asia and the Pacific. Hawaii is the first example of a formally annexed piece of land in the American empire. So Hawaii is initially going to be settled. Well, it has a native population, but it's going to initially be explored by, you guessed it, the British, by James Cook, way back in that India presentation. So we are going to see a very gradual increase of European or Western presence in Hawaii. At first, it's missionaries. They're bringing with them Christianity and Western education, but they're also bringing with them STDs and disease. So very much like the Columbian Exchange, about half of Hawaiians will die. So this is going to be perfect ground for economic imperialism. We are going to see the establishment of a lot of Western-owned businesses in Hawaii. First, it's European powers like the British. Then it's going to be the Americans by the end of the 1800s. So we are going to see the creation of a plantation system led by American businessmen, led by especially sugar growers and pineapple growers. And to fill the gap of a decreased labor supply, we are going to see a lot of Indian, Chinese, and Japanese immigration to Hawaii. And Hawaii is going to become a largely dominated place by American businesses. We are going to see these businessmen have significant political sway within Hawaii. They are going to depose the Hawaiian monarchy eventually by the end of the 1800s. The last queen of Hawaii is this lady up here, Lili Ulakaliani. I said that wrong. But we are going to see eventually these businessmen take over in Hawaii, and they will formally petition the American government to take over Hawaii. So that's how Hawaii becomes a territory and eventually state of the United States. But what's going on in the Philippines? Because this is an area you probably might not be as familiar with. The Philippines originally was a Spanish colony going back to the 1500s, really. It's named after, God hates me. It's named after King Philip II of Spain. But much of Spanish occupation in the Philippines, and I'm going to move now because I need to charge my laptop, is going to be resistance to Spanish rule. Much of Filipino history is resistance to Spanish rule. The Spanish are very brutal in their conquest of the Philippines, in the establishment of Christianity, Catholicism especially. So there is ongoing resistance against the Spanish. And one of the leaders by the end of the 1800s is a dude by the name of Emiliano Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo wants to create an independent Philippines, a republic free of the Spanish. And so he's going to look for allies. Who is he going to find? It's going to be your boy, the United States. The United States will readily support, well, initially, a resistance movement against the Spanish, especially when the United States goes to war with Spain. And we'll talk about the Spanish-American War, what caused it, more in a second. But the Philippines will be claimed by the United States as a result of the Spanish-American War. There, I'm charging my computer now. So the Philippines will come under American occupation, and that will be, a thing until the end of World War II, 1946 about. And Aguinaldo's promise of an independent Philippines is not going to be achieved. So there's going to be another resistance movement, this time against the US of A, baby. However, the American response to this resistance movement is one of extremely brutal repression. We are going to see a very brutal suppression of a Filipino insurrection. We are going to see the US Army torturing prisoners. We will see them burning down crops and villages, forcing rebels into concentration camps. And around 200,000 Filipinos will die during this American American occupation of the Philippines. However, we are going to see a lot of reaction against this back in the United States. A lot of people are going to say, oh my God, we're the best nation on earth. We can't brutalize indigenous people in a foreign country. well, they did. But there is going to be public backlash against the occupation of the Philippines. So the United States is going to have a very softened approach when it comes to ruling over this series of islands. We are going to see more economic development in the Philippines rather than more direct suppression of Filipino cultural identity. But the Philippines will remain a part of the American system until the end of World War II. So we got our two examples of formal empire, of more direct government control over overseas territory. So we got Hawaii, we got the Philippines, awesome. But the main area we are going to see American imperialism is through trade, is through economics. So we call this idea of economic imperialism. This is often referred to as free trade imperialism or informal imperialism. These all mean the same thing. Basically, it is the idea of economic dominance of a weaker country by a stronger one, by a more powerful one. And yet the weaker state, the weaker country, is still politically independent. So we are going to see a lot of natural resources in places like Latin America, especially. These resources will be owned and produced by American businesses. So much of the natural resources of Latin American republics will make them a target of the growing informal American empire. So we are going to see the exploitation by British and American entrepreneurs to exploit natural resources in Latin America. And oftentimes we are going to see collaboration by local elites. We will see foreign companies make generous concessions to of Latin American elites making generous concessions to American businesses. And mostly this is because these white elites in Latin America, they want to have modernization. They want to be involved in the industrial global trading network. So support from local elites is kind of encouraging imperialism in the Americas. And on top of that, these wealthy Latin Americans will benefit from Europe, from imperialism, meaning the economic imperialism with the United States. It's a way of the property owning white class in Latin America to gain even more wealth. And as such, there is an interest among this elite to continually have friendly relations with the United States. So a lot of the developments we'll see in Latin America are mostly designed to keep the United States the dominant economic power in that country. And one of the prime examples of this is Cuba, or Cuba, as the Cubans would like to say. So the American interest in Cuba goes back to, it goes back basically when the country started. Thomas Jefferson wanted to claim Cuba as his own for, years. But for much of Cuban history, even as a colony of Spain, there is an interest in having American businesses stay open in Cuba, especially businesses that own tobacco plantations and sugar plantations. So there are going to be significant amounts of American capital invested in Cuba. But it turns out Cubans don't like being a part of the Spanish Empire, so they're going to rebel. And this is a little concerning for the US. I mean, the United States doesn't really care about Spain occupying Cuba per se, but they are concerned that these rebels and the continued presence of a rebellion might disrupt trade for the United States. So what does the United States do? The government will send the USS Maine, a military ship, down into Havana to prevent potential outbreak of violence. Basically, if the United States is there, they can observe and possibly prevent violence. They can possibly prevent the seizing of American land. However, the USS Maine is going to mysteriously explode. What the heck? It will blow up in Havana Harbor, like boom. It's not really clear why this happens. It might have been a just accident and something blew up. However, there is going to be justification, especially in the American public opinion, for war against the Spanish. So we go to war with the Spanish. The United States and Spain fight it out in the Spanish-American War. However, before I even say that, the slogan for the Spanish-American War is, of course, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. I swore there, I'm sorry. And the Americans are going to win in the Spanish-American War. It's very much a one-sided victory. The United States industrial navy. The Spanish, they've spread themselves a bit too thin. They haven't modernized their military. So they are going to lose their territory in Southeast Asia, in places like the Philippines and Guam. And in the Caribbean, they are going to lose their territory in Puerto Rico. So two of these three territories are still territories of the United States today, Guam and Puerto Rico. The Philippines, of course, gets its independence later. But as a result of the American victory, we have the securing of formal empire with territories like the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, what does this mean for Cuba? Well, let me say something at least 3 times. Cuba is not going to be a territory of the United States. Cuba, not a territory of the United States. Cuba, not a territory of the United States. Cuba, not a territory of the United States. You will not believe your eyes. You will not believe yourself. A lot of people get this confused, so please don't. Cuba, not a part of the United States. And yet, despite getting its independence, Cuba is going to see frequent American military intervention, mostly as a result of this thing called the Platt Amendment. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. Basically, what this says is that America has the right to intervene whenever it pleases in Cuba. Say there's an election and the president who wins isn't the guy the United States likes, doesn't seem pro-American / business friendly enough. Well, clearly there's voter fraud, there's violence, so you need to send in the American troops to overthrow this democratically elected president. So we are going to see constant military intervention in Cuba on the part of American business interests. And American business interest is going to expand after Cuban independence. The United States basically controls the economy of Cuba, although it doesn't directly control the government of Cuba. So we are going to see frequent economic presence in Cuba. Businessmen have basically the run of the land in Cuba. The mafia, for example, owns all of the casinos in Havana by the 1950s. And it's a government in Cuba. The governments of Cuba that promote this American business are going to be very brutal regimes, as we'll talk about in the Cold War. They are going to be very much against calls for change, against unfair business practices. So on top of a resentment of the American economic presence, you have a resentment of American-backed dictators. Hopefully, no one grows tired of this in Cuba. Spoiler alert, they do. In the 1950s, a certain bearded guy by the name of Fidel Castro will rebel against the American-backed Cuban government. But right now, Cuba, constant military intervention by the United States. We see very similar trends throughout Latin America. Indeed, we are going to see frequent military intervention across Latin America. We are going to see frequent intervention, especially to promote American business interests. Say some Central American country elects a guy that's not exactly pro-US. Well, that means it's bad for business. Got to send in the troops to do a coup, an overthrow of the government, in favor of a pro-Western political leader. So we are going to see frequent American coups in places like the Dominican Republic, in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. These are places where we are going to see a lot of American business interest. It's also places we'll see a lot of loans by American banks being given. And in order to repay these loans and to repay all of this economic debt, well, it's going to be a hard time for these countries. And if they don't pay back their loans, well, you got to send in American troops. And this is going to be really a trend in Latin American history, really until today, you could argue, but will be especially intensified during the 20th century, as we will see. It will be prevalent in the late 1800s, but also during the Cold War. So there's a continuity and change right there, but we'll talk about the Cold War later on, obviously. And we are going to see frequent military intervention to protect American business interests in places like Guatemala right here. And just to give an example from the 20th century, in the 1950s, Guatemala will try to nationalize land owned by foreign companies, meaning foreign companies who have at least up to, well, in Guatemala's case, half of its land. So half of Guatemala's land is owned by a little thing called the United Fruit Company. They are going to, this president in Guatemala is going to say, hey, we don't want the Americans owning half of our land. We are going to take that land over, give it to peasants. Well, the United States hates this and will send in military troops to oust an undemocratic, quote unquote, leader. So that's an example of American imperialism at play. To secure economic interests, we see frequent military intervention. But one of the places in the 20th century, the early 20th century, is the building of the Panama Canal. So Panama at this time is owned by Colombia. And Colombia is hesitant to give a canal to the Americans. So what do the Americans do? Well, they're going to support local elites in the region of Panama. These local elites will declare independence from Colombia, and Panama is independent. What does Panama do immediately afterwards? Well, in recognition for the United States' help, Panama grants land rights to American companies to own a strip of land for the Panama Canal. So this is an example of how we have political action to secure economic imperialism. So consider what is informal imperialism. Maybe contrast that with formal imperialism. And then how does or did the United States practice both of these types of imperialism? And you should be able to clarify where. So pretty short lecture today, right? I'm going to end and we are going to pick up next presentation about the Ottomans and the Russians, everyone's favorite pairing there. Who will win, Russia or the Ottomans? Actually, that will come up tomorrow, our next presentation. We will talk about something called the Crimean War, but we'll talk about this later. Anyway, I've gone over time. Thank you so much for listening. God is regarded as a religious figure in some Abrahamic religions. Have a great day. You're so wonderful.